Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Penn Museum. My name is Kate Quinn, and I'm the Director of Exhibitions and Public Programs here at the museum. So thank you for joining us on this beautiful day for a fantastic lecture. It's my pleasure to introduce my colleague and curator of our major exhibition, The Golden Age of King Midas, which I hope you'll all take the time to see if you haven't already before it closes next week. Dr. Brian Rose. Brian is the co-director of the excavation at the site of Gordian in Turkey, the head of the post-Bronze Age excavations at Troy, the immediate past president of the Archaeological Institute of America, a trustee of the American Academy of Rome, and curator in charge of the Mediterranean section here at the Penn Museum. His lecture today will reveal startling new archaeological discoveries that have been made in Turkey in the past 25 years. After the lecture is completed, you can purchase a catalog for the exhibition, and Brian is going to be kind enough to sign publications for you. And that'll happen right outside of the door here. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Brian Rose.
Okay, my thanks to Kate for introducing me, and thanks to all of you for coming today. All of you by now will be familiar with the archaeological discoveries, the rich archaeological discoveries that the Penn Museum has been fortunate in making at Gordian over the course of the last 66 years. But this is only one chapter in a very long history of archaeological discoveries that have been made in Turkey, which is one of the richest archaeological areas of the world. And if I were to present all of the archaeological discoveries made in Turkey, those of considerable import during the last 30 years, we would be here all day. So I have only singled out some of my favorites of the greatest hits of archaeological discoveries that one could have seen in Turkey starting in the 1980s and continuing up to the present. So as we go through this material, I'll take you on a temporal journey from the 10th millennium BC at the beginning of the Neolithic period through the Middle Byzantine period, roughly the early 11th century AD. And we start with a pointer that's not working. We start with the site of Goebeklitepe, which is a site known to many of you. Goebeklitepe is located in southeastern Turkey, very close to the city of Urfa, and it was a discovery that was made only a few decades ago. And if you had asked me, if you had asked me 40 years ago, I would have been 20 years old, and I wouldn't have known what to say to you. But if you had asked anyone, any archaeologist, 40 years ago, 30 years ago, whether or not something like this was there to find, they would have told you it was impossible. This is a site dating to the early Neolithic period, a series of stone circles, as you see here in actuality and here in a reconstruction. Altogether, 20 of these stone circles have been found, circles that are demarcated with these enormous monolithic stone pillars that are about 5.5 meters high, so roughly 17 feet high, arranged in a circle like Stonehenge, but 7,000 years earlier than Stonehenge, a little more than 7,000 years earlier. So about 20 of these in all. The diameter measures between 10 and 30 meters. And these pillars are 5.5 meters high, and they're monolithic. So they're weighing about 15 tons apiece. They're incredible. This is an incredible public works project. 10 of them have actually been excavated, and another 10 have been discovered with remote sensing, the technique of magnetometry or magnetic prospection, which is a technique that we all use with great frequency these days. So the astonishing thing about these stone circles, these 20 stone circles, is that they're ornamented with reliefs, and they seem to be anthropomorphic. In that, as you see, you've got belts across some of them and hands that are carved in relief on some of them. So they seem to stand for human figures, and they contain the oldest stone relief sculpture that's ever been found. And you can see some of it here. There are headless humans, birds of prey, scorpions, snakes. There's even this very unusual corpse lacking its head, but nevertheless having an erect phallus. So the sexual features of some of these images are just as striking as the fact that we have stone relief sculpture for the first time in history. How were these being used? In all likelihood, these were cult centers, our earliest temples, as people often say, our earliest sanctuaries. What people did in these sanctuaries is difficult to say, but it's difficult to interpret them any other way. And we just have these 20 or so stone circles, no houses, no settlement whatsoever, just this isolated cult site at the beginning of the Neolithic period. Now, as astonishing as this is, what's even more astonishing for me is that some, I don't want to say archaeologists, but some historians have looked at this site and have said, well, the site is located between the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers, and this represents the beginning of the Neolithic period. The Neolithic period begins when we have a transition from hunter-gatherers to farmers. And so in a number of Neolithic sites, you'll have animal bones that will show that the animals have been domesticated, and domesticated crop evidence as well. What some historians have done is to point to this and say, well, should we be thinking of Genesis in the Bible when we think of this site? Because what happens with the story of Adam and Eve? They're picking apples, they're hunter-gatherers at the beginning of the story, and they're farming at the end of the story. So is that a microcosm or a symbol of the beginning of the Neolithic period? And should we be viewing Goebeklitepe as a site that should somehow be linked to the Garden of Eden? As I say, this is one of the strangest interpretations I've seen. But what we've witnessed are large groups of evangelical Christian tours who are coming to Goebeklitepe because, oh, thank you, because they viewed it as the Garden of Eden. Now, there is no connection between Goebeklitepe and the Garden of Eden. There's no reason to view it as the Garden of Eden, but it gives you an idea of the unusual interpretations that have been brought to bear on striking archaeological discoveries that have been made in the course of the last few decades. Equally, we have new information about the geography of Turkey and the area that surrounds it, specifically the Black Sea. So with recent work in underwater archaeology, we've been able to determine that originally the Black Sea was a freshwater lake and became a saltwater lake only in the middle of the 6th millennium BC when water from, here, I'm just going to use my hands, when water from the Mediterranean pushed through what is now northwestern Turkey and turned the Black Sea from freshwater to saltwater, thereby causing floods throughout the area. So again, some have pointed to this major change in environment and have said, well, is this the origin of the story of Noah and the flood? No, is the answer to that. But it is a striking new discovery. There were, of course, many floods in antiquity. Leonard Woolley found evidence for a flood at Ur, as you'll see in our Iraq's Ancient Past gallery. And really, almost anywhere one excavates in the ancient Near East, one can find evidence for floods. There were many floods. No reason to link this to the flood story that was in the Bible. And flood stories, of course, you find in almost every ancient culture. But this is a major change in our understanding of the area, the dramatic shift in the Black Sea and what that will have meant for habitation in the surrounding area. Now, I've had the good fortune, as some of you know, to co-direct excavations at Troy for the last 25 years. And here, too, in our excavations that began in 1988, we've been able to make some startling new discoveries. All of you are familiar, I think, with the monumental fortification walls of Troy 6, late Bronze Age Troy. These walls were about between 4 and 5 meters thick and rose over 10 meters high. And you can see what they look like as you enter the site today, and also what they look like in our recent reconstruction of the area here. So you can see that we have limestone about 8 or 9 meters high with a mud brick capping directly above that. Recently, we've done new remote sensing, geomagnetic sensing in the lower city of Troy. So here you're seeing an aerial view of the Mound of Troy, and here the lower city, the residential district of Troy, which was the residential district of the settlement from the 3rd millennium BC all the way through the 14th century AD, nearly 4,000 years of residential activity. And using a machine that looks like this, which we've also used at Gordian, some of you will recognize it from the Gordian exhibit on the other side of these walls, we've been able to get an excellent idea of subsurface features. What are the walls, buildings, and streets that lie beneath the surface of the city? So here you're seeing an aerial view of the Mound of Troy. This is also the Mound of Troy. This is the same photo. And here the lower city with the magnetic prospection results superimposed upon it. And so you can see the streets of the Roman residential district at right angles to each other, what we call an orthogonal grid. And you can even see the outlines of the houses that have been constructed between those streets. And about 400 meters south of the citadel, so in this area, we were fortunate in finding some very unusual ditches. And you're seeing here in a plan the streets of the Roman residential district and the ditches that we found underlying those Roman houses. Now, what are these ditches? We did dig them, and you see our first trench. When we were researching in this area, again about 400 meters south of the citadel, we got some readings, this was 1992, that indicated a major structure lay underneath the surface. And this was a sort of embarrassing discovery because the journalists came to the site at the end of the 1992 season and said, "We understand that you've made a dramatic discovery." And we said, "No, we just know that 400 meters south of the mound, there's something monumental." And they said, "Could it be a wall?" And we said, "Yes, of course it could be a wall, but we haven't dug it yet. All we know is that there's something monumental there." And they said, "Could it be of Bronze Age date?" And we said, "Yeah, of course it could be of Bronze Age date. I mean, it could be of any date. Remote sensing won't give you the date of something. It will only tell you that something is there. You have to dig it to date it." And so the New York Times did an article in September of 1992 saying, "Late Bronze Age fortification walls of the residential district of Troy have been found." And Achilles and Patroclus and Hector and Cassandra and everybody else ran around these walls at the end of the Bronze Age, which is, of course, not what we found, nor what we said to the journalists. It's a lesson to archaeologists, a lesson we have to tell ourselves about literally every year. Be careful when you talk to journalists. I mean, that's true for all of us, because they need to develop a story, and they'll take the kernel of what you tell them and fashion a phenomenal discovery, which we would never make. Because when we dug that area that looked so promising at the beginning of the 1993 season, we found a rock-cut ditch rather than a monumental fortification wall. And so there was an article right after that in the New York Times saying, "Their wall is a ditch," which made us look ridiculous. But it was nevertheless an incredibly important discovery, because over the course of time, oh, thank you. Well, I now have 3 laser pointers. Over the course of, thank you, Gareth. Over the course of time, we were able to dig various places around the perimeter of the lower city, and we found evidence for a rock-cut ditch in each of the areas where we excavated. And so you see one of those trenches here and our reconstruction of it. This is actually what we found, and here at the left are reconstruction of what we think that area looked like 3,000 years ago. So here we have evidence for a gatehouse, and then the ditch continuing around and also continuing over here, completely encircling the residential district of Troy. And so it's clearly intended for fortifications, although what's perplexing is that we don't have good evidence for a wall on the interior side of the fortification ditch, which is something that one typically does find. Here in the reconstruction, we've used a wooden palisade with an earthen embankment behind it, and that may well be the case, although we can't prove it conclusively. But in any event, we found evidence for a 2-tiered defensive system at Troy in the Late Bronze Age, the 14th and 13th centuries BC, the period during which Western Asia Minor was experiencing armed conflict between the Mycenaean Greeks and the Hittites and the allies of the Hittites over the course of about 2 centuries. Now, if we move from the Late Bronze Age into the Iron Age, there have been additional dramatic discoveries made even more recently. And I take you to this area along the Euphrates River, which is the area where one would now find the border between Turkey and Syria, and to the site of Tel Tayanat, which is a site excavated by Tim Harrison of the University of Toronto, one of the most important, what we call Neo-Hittite city-states in the area. While digging in the vicinity of a monumental building, they found an equally monumental statue, which fortunately had an inscription on the back of the statue that enables us to identify him. Now, this statue was about 4 meters high. That's between 13 and 14 feet high, a gigantic statue of one of the kings of Tel Tayanat, one of these strong citadels lying along the banks of the Euphrates. And the king's name was Shupaliliuma, not the famous Shupaliliuma that some of you may be thinking of from the Hittite kingdom in the 14th century BC, but another Shupaliliuma from the 9th century BC, probably a contemporary of the Assyrian king Shalmaneser III. And you can see, you get an idea of how monumental this was simply by looking at Tim Harrison, the excavator, and the former Minister of Culture and Tourism of Turkey standing on either side of it, and also looking at the excavator himself next to the newly discovered statue. This was fairly common for Neo-Hittite kingdoms, but rarely do we find statues like this completely intact. And he's holding in his hands a spear and sheaths of wheat, which is often what one finds with these monumental statues, some attribute of war and some attribute of fertility. I mean, that's true for honorific statues across the board, even if you look at 20th century statues. The wife of Giuseppe Garibaldi in the middle of Rome, you have Anita Garibaldi during the war for the unification of Italy, and she's got a baby in one hand and a pistol in the other. Or you look at images of Athena with a spear in one hand and a distaff or a spindle for weaving in the other. So some mark of fertility or the home in one hand and a mark of war in the other. That's the standard. Now, Gordion is a site with which you're all familiar as a consequence of the exhibit in the 2 rooms on either side of this auditorium. And as you know, the site has been excavated by the University of Pennsylvania for the last 66 years. And I only single out 2 discoveries, fairly recent discoveries of the many that have been made at Gordion. One involves the ivory lion tamer, which is on display in the exhibit. And it was my colleague, my recently deceased colleague, Keith DeVries, who proposed that we should view this as one of the components of the wood and ivory throne that Midas dedicated to the sanctuary of Apollo at Delphi, being the first foreign king, according to the Greek historian Herodotus, to make such a dedication. And if you look at thrones in Assyrian reliefs, such as the one you see here, or in Urartu, the kingdom to the east of Phrygia, you get an idea of how figural elements could be incorporated into the overall design. Now, this remains a theory, but a very compelling one. And in any event, this is in an Anatolian style, datable to the late 8th century, and found in front of the treasury of the Corinthians, which is where Herodotus says the throne of Midas was visible. The other discovery, of course, is connected to Tumulus MM, the so-called Midas Mound excavated by Rodney Young in 1957, and containing the oldest standing wooden building in the world, the assemblage of which you can see, of course, in the middle of the exhibit. It's only recently that the shroud that covered the body found in Tumulus MM has been analyzed, and we found that it was treated with an inorganic pigment, an iron oxide called goethite, named after the German poet Goethe, which gave it a strong golden color. And this developed into one of our new theories, only 4 years old, wherein we proposed that the story of the Golden Touch is related to the unusual treatment applied to the clothing of the elite of the city. And so the golden touch would therefore be applied to Midas and to Gordian and to Phrygia, not because they used a lot of gold implements. Indeed, from what we can see, they didn't, but rather because the people themselves looked golden as they walked through the streets of the city in formal processions. These tomb chambers in Gordian and in Phrygia in general were wooden, and that would last for several centuries until there would be a move to stone tumuli, or stone tomb chambers in monumental burial mounds in Western Turkey and Southern Turkey. But in a few cases, the wooden tomb chambers continued, even into the 5th century BC, the ones that had first been designed in Phrygia. And a case in point is the site of Tatarla, near the modern Turkish city of Afyon, where a wonderful wooden tomb chamber has been excavated, dating to the first half of the 5th century BC. Now, unfortunately, as with many tombs in Turkey, this one had been plundered. And this was especially tragic because the tomb chamber contained our best wooden tomb paintings that have ever been found. You can see them here in this recreation. So the decedent's activities in war were rendered on the sides of the tomb chamber. You see a detail here which seems to show a combat between Persians and Scythians, and then a funeral service here, presumably with the decedent in a biga, a two-wheeled chariot, being led in procession through the city and gradually out to the tumulus. Now, this is extraordinary. We don't have anything this good anywhere. And when it was plundered, some of the painted wooden beams were stolen from the tomb chamber and showed up in Munich and were recognized by a Turkish archaeologist, Latife Summerer, who convinced the Germans, in tandem, of course, with the officials of the Ministry of Culture and Tourism in Turkey, that these wooden paintings should be repatriated to Turkey. She was able to prove that they had to have been looted from this particular tomb chamber, and so they have been repatriated. And the newly reconstituted tomb will soon be on display in the Afyon Archaeological Museum. Now, some of our most exciting tombs have been found in and around the Granicus River, which is where Alexander had the first of his major battle with the Persians in 334 BC. This was a survey that I was lucky enough to direct between 2004 and 2007. So just to orient you, this is a space shuttle photograph. Troy would be here, the Dardanelles or Hellespont here, leading into the Sea of Marmara, and then Istanbul and the Bosphorus here, and the Black Sea, of course, up here. The Granicus River you see here, and a new map that we prepared charting the location of the new or newly explored tumuli or monumental burial mounds along the sides of the river. The most exciting of these is a burial mound that contained two sarcophagi. One sarcophagus is, of course, a stone box that contained the body of the dead person. Sarcophagus is just a Greek word meaning, in essence, flesh eater, because the lime in the stone would cause the body to disintegrate at a more rapid pace. And so you see one of these stone sarcophagi here surrounded by roof tiles, and then another sarcophagus here. Now, this sarcophagus, which we call the Polyxena sarcophagus, dating to 500 BC, had been robbed in antiquity. You can see the hole cut through the side of the sarcophagus. But all of the reliefs around the sarcophagus were intact and had not been damaged by the looters, and those looters were ancient looters. There was just as much of a tomb robbing problem in antiquity as there is in the modern period. So the earliest stone sarcophagus with figural scenes ever to have been discovered, 500 BC, reliefs on all four sides of the sarcophagus. The principal side, or the mythological side, showed scenes from the Trojan War, from the end of the Trojan War, which is understandable because Troy lies about an hour and a half's drive west of this area by car. And as many of you know, the Trojan War is flanked by the sacrifice of two women, the sacrifice of a Greek woman, Iphigenia, at the beginning of the Trojan War, the sacrifice of a Trojan woman at the end of the war, and that would be Polyxena, daughter of King Priam, the king of Troy. And you see here Neoptolemus, the son of Achilles, plunging a dagger into her neck, slicing the carotid artery. This is a detail of this, as the Greek associates of Neoptolemus hold the body of Polyxena, who almost looks as if she's kicking, as she sacrificed to the gods. When you're slaying a woman on the battlefield, the knife would go into the chest. When you're sacrificing a woman as a gift to the gods or to deceased heroes, such as Achilles, you slice the carotid artery of the neck. That signifies sacrifice. And she is being sacrificed to his father, Achilles, whose tomb lies directly behind the body of his son. So here's the tomb of Achilles with a terminal stone on top that would mark it as an artificial tomb, not a natural feature of the landscape. On the opposite side of this, you had women engaged in lively conversation at a kind of drinking party. Not a symposium per se, but a party on and around a cline, a banqueting couch. So you see that these are all women. What's interesting about the sarcophagus is 75% of the figures around the sarcophagus are female, which is extraordinarily rare in ancient funerary iconography. And you can see they're engaged in elaborate conversation by virtue of the position of the hands and the size of the hands. These are the largest hands that we have in ancient art as a way of indicating the animated conversation that is in process. And just around the corner, you have a series of musicians. Here is one of them playing the castanets, the krotala in Greek, and there's a lyre player, a flute player, etc., as armed warriors are dancing to the music made by the women. An extraordinary discovery. And next to it was this sarcophagus, which had no reliefs around the body of the sarcophagus, but which had never been robbed. And it's about 50 years later than the so-called Polyxena sarcophagus. So this is about 450. It contained the body of a child who suffered from cribra orbitalia, a disease that can be caused by malnutrition, by anemia, or by malaria. And when this happens, you often find a skull with what almost look like pinpricks in the skull. And in this case, the body was that of a child between the ages of 8 and 10, almost certainly a girl. Based on the discoveries inside the sarcophagus, there was a great deal of gold, 8 identical gold earrings, 2 gold bracelets with antelope head terminals, and then 2 necklaces, a mixture of gold and glass. So the red is glass. These discoveries are now in the Çanakkale Museum in northwestern Turkey, which is the museum closest to the site of Troy, and they will be on display in the new Troy Museum, the construction of which is nearly complete. So some of our best jewelry from northwestern Turkey that's ever been found. And then just to the south of this was a sarcophagus dating to the first quarter of the 4th century BC that unfortunately was found by the looters before we worked on it with the Çanakkale Museum. So the looters approached the burial mound with a front-end loader and clawed away at the tomb chamber, knowing that eventually they would hear the sound of metal striking stone. And so they clawed away a part of the sarcophagus right here. Nevertheless, there was a great deal still surviving, and during a rescue excavation by the Çanakkale Archaeological Museum, they were able to reconstruct the tomb chamber that had been destroyed by the looters, and also to rescue the sarcophagus, which has much of its original paint still surviving, and which seems to show a sequential narrative. So the decedent, victorious in the boar hunt, so originally spearing a boar between the eyes as his hunting dogs attack it, and another stag hunting scene was over here to the left of the tree. You see one of those stags. And then the same gentleman on the opposite, or on the adjacent side, with his very unusual Persian-inspired armor, spearing a fallen foe in the eye who has fallen against this very rocky and tree-covered landscape. It's difficult to say whether this is a Greek, as evinced by the Greek fillet that he's wearing on his head, or some other kind of opponent. But the point is that we have the decedent shown victorious in the hunt and victorious on the field of battle, with the speared eye motif used to unite the two foes of the decedent, one human and one animal. And we can tell from his skeleton, all these blackened sections we actually discovered in the sarcophagus, that he suffered a fall from a considerable height when he was about 25 years old, and his bones healed but badly, and so he walked with a limp for about 5 years. I mean, it's almost as if we knew this guy, given what I'm telling you now. But he was in considerable pain during that 5-year period because the bones did not heal properly, and he died at the age of about 30. And so it's not unlikely that at the age of 25, after this accident, his sarcophagus was commissioned, and it would have been ready by the time he died 5 years later. Many striking tombs have been found in southern Turkey over the last few decades. This is one of the most impressive, the site of Karaburun in what is now southwestern Turkey, the area of Lycia, dating to about 470 BC and excavated by Bryn Mawr College in the early 1970s, showing the decedent on his banqueting couch with his attendants bringing him a variety of gifts. You see how well preserved those paintings are, and I'm showing it to you even though it was found 45 years ago, because recently it has been plundered. So the looters got into the tomb and managed to take the wall paintings off the walls of the tomb. Now this is extraordinarily disturbing in and of itself, but these are famous paintings. There's no way these can be sold on the art market. They've been published over and over again. If they came up for sale at Sotheby's or Christie's, everyone would say, these have been stolen from Turkey. So why would anyone do this? Why would looters go into a tomb with conservators, because there's no other way you could safely get the painting off the stone wall? How could this happen? It must be because they already had a buyer in mind. Or, as I often say, it looks as if it must have been a looting to order, an ordered plundering. So these paintings are somewhere now in someone's basement recreation room where they can be enjoyed by the looter or by the man or woman who paid for the looting and the friends of those looters. And someday, hopefully, they will come to light again. But for now, it's an example of how tragic these lootings are, even in sites and with monuments that are extraordinarily well published. One of the most interesting new discoveries was also associated with looting. This is the site of Mylasa in ancient Caria in southwestern Turkey, beneath a temple of Zeus, Zeus Carios, so the region of Caria. This is the region also where Halicarnassus is located, the site of one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, the mausoleum of Halicarnassus, which would have been here. Halicarnassus was the later capital of the kingdom of Caria. The earlier capital was Mylasa, modern-day Milas. And you see this very picturesque column with a stork's nest on top. Storks love to nest on top of standing ancient columns, which is one of the most charming things in the world. But in this case, the looters had bought a house adjacent to the temple, and they had tunneled vertically through the floor 12 meters. And so they had very sophisticated equipment to tunnel down through 12 meters, and at the bottom of that tunnel, that vertical shaft, they came into a burial chamber, which you can see here, which has a kind of barrel vaulted appearance. And within it, they found a phenomenal sarcophagus, which you see here and here. 9 feet long, one of the longest stone sarcophagi that's ever been found, even longer than the Polyxena sarcophagus, which is giant, and nearly as long as the Alexander sarcophagus, showing the decedent on a banqueting couch, holding a fiale, or a bowl, in his hands, again with servants, or conceivably his wife. This is probably his wife, but servants on the other side bringing gifts to him, as you saw in that tomb at Harbour excavated by Bryn Mawr College. This is one of the most extraordinary discoveries that has been made, and it's not unlikely that this is one of the Carian kings. He's been identified as Hecatomnus, the founder of the dynasty that yielded Mausolus and Artemisia, the husband and wife, brother and sister, who were responsible for the mausoleum of Halicarnassus. Now, eventually we move into the Roman period and out of the Hellenistic period. As you know, Octavian, later to be Augustus, fought a climactic war with Mark Antony and Cleopatra in 31 BC at the Battle of Actium in what is now northwestern Greece, and emerged victorious. He was the adopted son of Julius Caesar, who was the first deified ruler in the Roman world, and so Augustus called himself son of a deified human, son of a Divus. So Divus Julius, Julius Caesar, my father, is a god, and Divi Filius, I am the son of a god, and here is the comet symbolizing the rising of the soul of Caesar into the heavens. Augustus was also a man who would show the weapons of war often used by the goddess of love and by Cupid, her son. So the weapons of war are played with by love and the associates of love because there's no need for them anymore. The world has been conquered by Augustus, and as a consequence, there's prosperity through the Roman world. So you see on his coinage, Augustus with his zodiac sign, the Capricorn, half goat, half fish, holding the globe of the world in its hooves and balancing a cornucopia of prosperity on its back. So Augustus has conquered the world, and as a result, there is prosperity everywhere. Now, people responded with great monuments in honor of Augustus and his descendants all over Asia Minor, but the most extraordinary of these monuments, dating to the early empire, has been found at Aphrodisias in southwestern Turkey. And I was lucky enough to dig this complex as a graduate student. It's really one of the most extraordinary experiences of my life. Aphrodisias, you see an aerial view here, and in the vicinity of these poplar trees was discovered a phenomenal complex intended to venerate Augustus and the successors within his dynasty. These would be the people some of you know of from I Claudius: Augustus, Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, and Nero, the so-called Julio-Claudian dynasty. Many significant archaeological discoveries are made by accident, and this was a case in point. It was known that there was a so-called Sebasteion, a building in honor of the ruler cult at Aphrodisias and dating to the early empire. It was known that it was somewhere. Many thought that it was located near the temple of Aphrodite, which was the primary temple of the site. Aphrodite, or Venus, was the divine matriarch of the family of Augustus and Julius Caesar. They traced their descent from Aeneas, the noble Trojan who escaped the burning city of Troy prior to its destruction, made his way to Italy, and emerged as the founder of the Roman people. No one thought to look here under the toilets of the excavation house, which is where the Sebasteion was ultimately found, and found only because in 1979, when the phone broke one day, the telephone repairman, came and, in digging a hole for the new telephone pole, began to find fragments of life-size marble reliefs dating to the early 1st century AD. Subsequently expanding that area, which required the removal of our toilets, we found the Sebasteion, this building that was known to exist at Aphrodisias, but no one was quite sure where. Sebasteion simply means a building in honor of Sebastos, which is the Greek word for Augustus. And so here you see the reconstruction of this phenomenal complex, a gateway and a temple to the early Roman emperors with a processional court flanked by porticos on either side that were three-storied, Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian, and between the columns were life-size marble reliefs on both sides. So 200 life-size marble reliefs dating to the early empire, most of which survive. And parts of this building have been re-erected by the current archaeological team, so you get an idea of this three-storied format, Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian. This is what you would see now if you go to Aphrodisias, and there are copies of the reliefs that have been set up on the facade, so you get an idea of what these intercolumniations would have looked like when they were filled with the figural decoration. And we can reconstruct. Yes, here are the three graces in the middle. The three graces are often attendants of the goddess Aphrodite. She is the principal goddess of Aphrodisias and the matriarch of the dynasty's genealogical tree. So she and her attendants are frequent inhabitants of the relief of this complex. So you have a mythological cycle that shows Aphrodite as mother. You can see here she's just given birth to Cupid. Here are the wings of Cupid sweeping down here. This is probably Anchises, the father of Aeneas, who mated with Venus and produced Aeneas, and probably the personification of the area where that mating occurred. And then you have a Trojan cycle that culminates in Aeneas with his father on his shoulders, leaving Troy with Aphrodite's protection and with his son Ascanius by his side. And they're conceived of as Easterners, so they wore, at least Ascanius wore trousers. They can't put trousers on Aeneas because trousers were worn by the Parthians, the successors to the Persians, and the Parthians were the fiercest enemies of the Romans. So it was sort of a touchy situation because the Trojans wore trousers. The Trojans are the founders of the Romans, and the Parthians wore trousers. They're the fiercest enemies of the Romans. So who wears the pants in ancient iconography? They give pants to the sun so that everyone knows that they're coming from the east, but they dress the father as a contemporary Roman general so that no one would think of mixing him up with a Parthian. Then you have the emperors themselves who are aggrandized and venerated, with Augustus, with this wonderful arcuated mantle or drapery, holding a rudder in one hand. He's guiding the Roman ship of state through troubled waters into prosperity. Here's another cornucopia, and the land offers him fruits, and the sea, you can see she's a mermaid, holds up the rudder. So you have Augustus as commander of land and sea, guiding the Roman ship through troubled waters into a realm of prosperity. This is fairly standard, full-blown iconography for the early Roman emperors, and their military victories were honored as well. So here you see the Emperor Claudius vanquishing the personification of Britain, who was represented as an Amazon. This was his primary military triumph. And the good thing about the Aphrodisians is they wrote down everything. So there was no guesswork. So you can see Claudius's name here and Britannia just barely visible here. When they would represent conquered personifications of regions, they would represent them as looking either like Amazons or Athena or Minerva, a powerful figure from classical mythology or religion. This was the first relief I found, Prometheus and Heracles. What they wanted to convey was that the emperors were just as strong, just as good, just as magnificent as the greatest heroes of Greek and Roman mythology. And so Heracles appears frequently because, of course, Heracles was a mortal who dies and then goes to Olympus, just like the emperors were expected to do. So here you see Heracles. This was taken by a National Geographic photographer who said, I want to make it an artistic image. And I said, after I saw it, well, what you've done is glorify the buttocks of Heracles. This really isn't what you should be aiming for. But, you know, so it goes. You can see him wearing the lion skin helmet, freeing Prometheus, who looks aggrieved from the Caucasus Mountains where he had been chained, and the eagle that had been eating his liver daily lies dead, having been killed by Heracles. So you can see it here just as it's emerging from the ground. Heracles, Prometheus, the eagle, and the personification, presumably, of the Caucasus Mountains where the scene took place. And then, if you want to show how big the Roman Empire is, one of the easiest ways is to give a physical form to each of the areas that has been conquered by the Romans, and then line them all up, as they have done here. So originally there were 50 women, each representing a different conquered area of the Roman Empire. And so here you see, and they've labeled them all, thereby taking the guesswork out of the equation for us. So the Perusti, which I used to say was Yugoslavia, but Yugoslavia doesn't exist anymore, so Montenegro. Dacia, ancient Romania. Thrace, the Bessi, that would be Bulgaria, and then Crete over here. This one, as you see, looks just like Minerva or Athena, even though it represents the subjugated group of Montenegrins. And that's because they needed martial women to use in their iconography, and there were only so many models that they had available to them. These sorts of imperial cult complexes you find all over Turkey during the Roman Empire, and a number of them from the 2nd century AD have recently been found at the site of Sagalassos. So you see the portrait of Heracles just beginning to emerge from the soil. This portrait is this portrait once it was cleaned, and next to it were found portraits of Marcus Aurelius and Faustina the Elder, the wife of Antoninus Pius. So it looks as if there was a statue gallery of all of the 2nd century emperors that were part of yet another complex that was intended for the imperial cult or the ruler cult. Now, in the domestic realm, there have also been striking discoveries. Many of you are familiar with the apartment houses or the residential complex at the site of Ephesus in the middle of the ancient city, where we have wall paintings and marble revetment, marble wall decorations surviving astoundingly well. This dates to the late 1st, 2nd, and early 3rd centuries AD, and you see it as you would see it now if you were to go to the site. And the exciting thing is that here we have such well-preserved paintings that we can get an idea of how people were living in the 3rd century AD. We already knew it from Rome and from Pompeii in the 1st century AD, but now we have a kind of later Roman imperial Pompeii that no one ever expected to find. So in terms of the paintings on the walls, these are extraordinary discoveries. And recently, extraordinary floor mosaics have been found at the site of Zeugma near Gaziantep. Now, this was an area where a monumental dam has recently been constructed, and before the dam was constructed, there was intensive excavation at the site of Zeugma, and the waters of the dam only cover part of the ancient site, so excavations there continue, and some of our most impressive floor mosaics ever found have been discovered in the late Roman houses there. Many of these are 2nd or 3rd century AD. So you see one of them being cleaned here, the 9 Muses. Here, Poseidon or Neptune and his consort Amphitrite. And then here, the Gaziantep Museum, which displays all of these mosaics once conservation was completed. So one of the greatest museums, not just in Turkey, but throughout the world. Perhaps the most impressive discovery of recent years, this is 2004, was made at Yenikapı in Istanbul, where the port of the Byzantine city was found as a new transportation hub was being constructed. So excavation began here for a tunnel for a train that would go under the Bosphorus and unite Europe and Asia. And as the developers began to dig, you see the excavation site here. They were lucky enough to find the ancient harbor, one of the ancient harbors of the city, the Harbour of Theodosius. And this yielded over 35 wooden boats that had collapsed or sunk in a storm dating to about 1000 AD. These are incredibly well-preserved wooden ships. So you see them being excavated here, and you see how well preserved they are here. The harbor, of course, had silted up over time. But when the ships sank, they sank with their cargo still in place. So in terms of ceramic studies, this is a bonanza because we know exactly what was loaded on the boats when they sank in the storm of 1000 AD. So really one of the most remarkable discoveries anywhere in the world, and this one within the last 20 years. These two will also be the focus of a new museum. As you go throughout Turkey, what really strikes you is how many buildings, how many ancient structures have recently been reconstructed. So you see here four of many examples. The gateway to the sanctuary of Aphrodite at Aphrodisias, first built in the 2nd century AD. The Temple of Athena at Assos, first built around 530 BC, which has recently been reconstructed. The sanctuary of Trajan, another one of these ruler cult sanctuaries at the site of Pergamon in northeastern Turkey, and one of the monumental fountains at Sagalassos, which I showed you a few slides ago in southwestern Turkey, which now operates again as a fountain. These are only a few of the phenomenally rich treasures that have been made in Turkey over the course of the last few decades. And so while I would love it if you were all to come to Gordian to visit this coming summer and to see the University of Pennsylvania's fieldwork project in operation, even more, I'd be grateful if you would take time out during that trip to begin to explore the wonders of Turkey, where you'll find 12,000 years of ancient history laid out before you, and many of those monuments newly reconstructed. So with that, I will close and thank you for listening to me today, and thank you for your support of the museum and the Midas exhibit. Thank you. So I'll be happy to answer any questions you might have. Again, I've only touched on some of the phenomenally rich archaeological discoveries made in Turkey in the course of the last few decades. Yes? The reliefs. Yeah. Yeah.
So, but are the originals still extant?
Yes. The originals are in the Aphrodisias Museum. They're all there. Well, we didn't find all 200. I mean, rarely do you find all of them, but there are 100 of them, many of which are complete, and those are in the museum. So you'll be in a new extension to the museum. So that is truly one of the wonders of ancient and modern Turkey, to get the chance to see all these phenomenally well-preserved reliefs. There are a number of sculptures in museums in different parts of the world, and Turkey has asked those museums to consider repatriating those sculptures to Turkey. This is something that we've seen as a phenomenon that has gathered greater energy within the last 2 decades. Not just Turkey, but also Italy, Greece, and other Mediterranean countries that have asked for components of their cultural heritage to be sent back. Many of these objects or archaeological discoveries have been plundered in earlier periods. So, yes. Yes? Yes, there was the province of Asia. The province of Asia ultimately comes from the kingdom of Pergamon, which occupied much of western Turkey during the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC. And the last king of Pergamon, Attalus III, willed his kingdom to Rome when he died in 133 BC, and that developed into the province of Asia. Yes? Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, thank you. Some of the greatest new discoveries that have been made and will continue to be made are made by underwater archaeologists. Underwater archaeology is a lot more difficult than land archaeology because you can only stay underwater for 20 minutes at a time to dig, to record, and to dig, and to rescue what you found, being careful of the conservation of the objects and bringing it to the surface. But more and more shipwrecks have been found. I mean, there was a great one that was found several decades ago. In fact, I should have included it here, the Lubar Une Shipwreck, which was excavated by George Bass, who used to be a curator at this museum in the 1960s, and then he went to Texas A&M University and founded the Institute for Nautical Archaeology. That's a shipwreck dating to the end of the 14th century BC, so just before 1300 BC, and still has its cargo. So that has completely changed our understanding of what Bronze Age trade was like in the Eastern Mediterranean. Yes? The Ephesus Excavations were closed 2 months in advance of the anticipated end of the season. It remains to be seen what will happen. I hope that an arrangement can be made wherein the Ephesus Excavations will open again next summer, but it's not clear what will happen with that. I can certainly say that with Gordian, we've been very fortunate in working hand in hand with the Turkish Ministry of Culture and Tourism for 66 years, and we enjoy very close relations with them. So my hope is that the rich archaeological discoveries that I presented to you today will continue to be made in the subsequent seasons. Yes? This is a man named Kutalmış Gürkay, who is a wonderful archaeologist teaching at Ankara University, and he has made some startling discoveries. In an earlier period, just before the dam was constructed, there was a rescue excavation by the Oxford Archaeological Unit, funded by David Packard of Hewlett-Packard, the son of the founder of Hewlett-Packard. David Packard is the world's leading expert in Linear A, the language used on Crete before the Mycenaean conquest, so 15th century BC, 16th century BC. It's never been translated. He knows more about it than anybody else. And he founded an institute called the Packard Humanities Institute and contributed between $5 and $10 million toward the excavation of parts of Zugma that would be covered by the water and the conservation of the mosaics that were found in the course of that rescue excavation. It's an international group of Turkish archaeologists working with American and British archaeologists. Okay, if there are no additional questions, you are welcome to buy a catalog of the Midas exhibit just outside this room. As you know, it was edited by me and by the Gordian archivist, Gareth Derbyshire, who was here today, and we'll be happy to sign any copies you care to buy. So thank you again for coming, for your support of the exhibit, and of course for your support of this museum. Thank you.